questions shortly. For those of you that don't know the Society, we were founded in 1707, famously at a meeting in a pub, the Bear Tavern, for the purpose of investigating and debating material remains of the past found in Britain. We were then awarded a Royal Charter by George III in 1751 and charged with the encouragement, advancement and furtherance of the study and knowledge of the antiquities and history of this and other countries. At the same time, we were given rooms in Somerset House in London, which we shared with the Royal Society, and that allowed us to care for a growing library and museum collection and hold meetings for fellows to discuss and debate their research into the material past. We moved into our present home at Burlington House in 1874, where we continue to focus on fellowship, conservation, research, and the dissemination of our work. Today, we remain focused on those core objectives, and as a registered charity, we're committed to sharing our collections and our work with the public, which we do through public lectures like this one today, public tours, exhibitions, scholarly research seminars, and a program of publications. So before I introduce the lecture, a little bit of housekeeping, if I may. There will be a question and answer session at the end. And if anyone would like to ask a question, can you type it into the chat function on Zoom, please? And we'd be grateful if you keep them. Sorry, I will ask the questions then at the end of the lecture, but if you would hold your questions until near the end of the lecture, it can be a bit distracting if they come through during. Okay, thank you very much. So, our first online lecture in our summer series, which celebrates our new online exhibition, Henry VIII, Defender of the Faith, ? Which launches tomorrow. The exhibition was created by our museum collections manager, Kate Bagnall, with support from Dr. John Cooper, who we're going to hear from today, Professor Morris Howard. Gathering our rarely seen portraits, manuscripts, books, and objects, this exhibition will explore the private life and public persona of the monarch on whom this title was conferred, how personal and political motivations led to Henry's shift from defender to adversary, and how the title of defended was restored and retained under the queenship of his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth. So our lecturer, Dr. John Cooper, is a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries and the Royal Historical Society. He's published books on Tudor royal propaganda and the Elizabethan spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, and is an editor of the journal Parliamentary History. He's now writing a book for Head of Zeus on the Royal Chapel in the Palace of Westminster that became the first House of Commons in 1548. John teaches at the University of York, where he is reader in early modern history. And he's going to tell us about Henry VIII, power, propaganda, and personality. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much, Heather. It's a great pleasure to be asked to give this talk at the Society of Antiquaries. In the words that are defining our times, I'm going to try and share my screen. Hopefully, can you all see that? Is that working?
Yes, all good.
Okay, good. Excellent. Well, as Heather says, this week we are launching an online exhibition, Henry VIII, Defender of the Faith, ? Which I've been helping to curate alongside our museums collections manager, Kate Bagnall. And I'd like to thank Kate, as Heather has, for all that she's done to deliver this exhibition at a time when accessing the collections has been challenging, to say the least. The museum collections of the Society of Antiquaries are extensive, eclectic, and for the Tudor period, simply stunning. Had we been able to hold this lecture in person, then you would just have walked past the Bosworth Cross, which was ploughed up in 1778 on the site of the battle that brought the Tudors to the throne. The cross may have been carried by the supporters of Richard III, hence its abandonment in the mud. We have it in a display case. In the meeting room, we would be watched by Hans Eworth's portrait of Mary I, arguably the finest surviving image of England's first ruling queen. A particular thrill for me is a piece of worked medieval stone, which was once part of St. Stephen's Chapel in the Palace of Westminster that Heather just mentioned, closed down by the boy king, Edward VI, to become the first permanent meeting place of the House of Commons. Well, none of these objects features today because we're focusing on Henry VIII. But the Society of Antiquaries is literally a treasure house of the material culture of the past. We also publish books and a journal, we host academic conferences, and we award grants for research and conservation. So if this is your first experience of the Antiquaries, please find out more about us. We even do Twitter, as you'll see on the final slide. 2021 marks 500 years since Henry VIII obtained the title of Defender of the Faith, in Latin Fidei Defensor, from the Medici Pope Leo X. Do you have a coin in your pocket? Okay, this only works for those of you in the UK, and I know we're not really using cash very much anymore. I have one here. If you take a look, I held that right up. If you take a look at the Queen's head side of a coin, technically the obverse, and you will see some letters, DG Reg FD. That is, Dei Gratia, by the grace of God, Reg for Regina, Queen, and then what we are looking for, FD, or sometimes Fid Def, Defender of the Faith. The title granted to Henry VIII is still part of the formal styling of British monarchs. And we may imagine, I think, that for the current Queen, defending the faith still really matters. Well, what it meant to defend the faith changed profoundly during Henry VIII's lifetime, as a direct result of his own actions and personality, as well as the context of the Reformation then taking part in Europe. The meaning of defender of the faith has evolved a whole lot more in the 5 centuries since Henry VIII's reign. But the unexpected survival of this title is one example of the continuing presence of the Tudors in our own utterly different modern world. The Tudors aren't simply dramatic and compelling and controversial, though they are all of those things. They continue to matter to a surprising degree in our everyday political and popular culture. The Tudors are also recognizable the world over. In my career, I've been fortunate to give talks on Tudor history from Nebraska to Nanjing, and everywhere it's the Tudors who make the connection. Now, my main aim today is to take you through some of the highlights of our exhibition, following the same chronological and narrative sequence, and commenting on what the objects tell us about Henry VIII's power, propaganda, and personality. And I've chosen 4 pairs of objects under the headings Chivalry and Pageantry, Defending the Faith, The Break from Rome, and Personality and Legacy. Now, we've selected objects for this exhibition based less on their aesthetic beauty, though one of the manuscripts I'm going to show you is rather lovely, than for their historical and antiquarian significance. So in a sense, this talk is just an extended advert for you to spend some time with the objects yourselves when the exhibition opens tomorrow. But underpinning that kind of Cooper tour of the objects is an argument about Henry VIII's kingship, the kind of arguments that I'm always on to my students to put in their essays. Henry's reign is often divided into a game of 2 halves, a comparatively carefree first half of pastime with good company, jousts and jokes, a great victory over the Scots, although to be fair, that victory was as much Catherine of Aragon's as Henry VIII's, and the glittering international diplomacy on show at the Field of Cloth of Gold. That was followed by a far more troubled second half of religious turmoil, the agony of the succession crisis, the biggest of all the Tudor rebellions, and the increasing infirmity and tyranny of the king. The pivot was the break from Rome and the Reformation of the Church. Thus, Catholic Henry in the first half and Protestant, or at least Reformed Henry in the second half. The problem with this chronology, and you probably knew from my tone of voice I was going to mess that up for you as soon as I'd set it up, is that every one of his biographers since John Fox in the later 16th century has had to grapple with this problem, is the awkward 1540s. The final 7 years of Henry VIII's life, following the execution of Thomas Cromwell, when he went back to ruling for himself rather than via a chief minister, and turned against the evangelical revolution that he'd launched with the breaking up of Catholic shrines and the dissolution of monasteries. Was Henry VIII at heart a Catholic without the Pope, as J.J. Scarisbrick proposed more than 50 years ago? That was what we were still debating in my A-level in Tudor history when I was at school. It certainly seems to stretch credibility to call Henry VIII a Protestant. Are these multiple changes of direction proof that Henry VIII was being influenced or even manipulated by those around him? Now, these are some of the questions that historians of Henry VIII have debated. I promise I will get to some slides. Bear with me. Within this shifting picture of Henry's allegiances and interests, I would like to suggest two strands of continuity and consistency, distinct from each other, but not mutually exclusive, which help us to understand how Henry VIII attempted to meet the many expectations of him as king. And the first is Henry's sense of continuity with the monarchs who went before him. We might construct the Tudors as a new dynasty, but they most definitely did not. They didn't, in fact, call themselves the Tudors. That's a later construction of history. In ritual and in liturgy, certainly within his own royal palaces, Henry VIII's instinct was to do what his royal forebears had done, following ceremonial and sacred patterns that were centuries old. In this way, he affirmed the legitimacy of his kingship, which by the 1530s, some of his subjects were calling into question. The second strand of consistency is Henry's view of the power inherent in the English crown, combined with his self-identification as a reformer. Asking Henry VIII whether Henry VIII was a Protestant, which I sometimes do to my students, is unfair because it's really the wrong kind of question. It reads history backwards from the perspective of the later Protestant Reformation. Ask whether Henry VIII was a reformer, however, and we can draw a connection between the title that Henry VIII was granted by the Pope in 1521 and the title that he awarded himself when he ousted the Pope in 1534. Well, that may not look very consistent to us, and opponents of Henry VIII certainly pointed that out at the time. But I suspect that the sense of responsibility for the religion of the nation derived from Henry's expansive definition of royal power did make sense inside his own head. We see a clear contradiction between Catholic and Protestant because of our knowledge of subsequent history, but those definitions were considerably more fuzzy for people caught up in the events that we're thinking about this lunchtime. Now, as you've heard, this lecture is the first of three, so Professor Maurice Howard follows on the 20th of July on the royal chapels at Hampton Court and St James's and the other palaces where the Tudor monarchs processed and worshipped. And then Professor Susan Doran reflects on queenship in early modern England on the 20th of August. And I've been reading work by Maurice Howard and Susan Doran all my life, so it's a pleasure to be talking in the same series as them. Okay, this is your starter for 10 question. Who was the last medieval English monarch? Well, not Henry VIII, surely. The king who broke away from the Catholic Church and created the Church of England, turning Parliament into a modern institution in the process. The military leader who saw that the potential of an island nation lay with a navy rather than the army, thus setting Britain on its way towards a future of maritime trade and colonial empire. The man of taste who latched on to the great Renaissance in the arts in Europe, who poached Hans Holbein to become an English court painter and incorporated elements of the classical style into his magnificent new palace at Whitehall and another one at Hampton Court. Doesn't sound very medieval. Henry VIII is remembered as a new kind of monarch, for better and for worse. It was in his reign that England's great monasteries came down in an astonishingly short period of time, which we're very aware of here in North Yorkshire, from where I'm broadcasting, just 4 years, to be repurposed as country houses or recycled into raw materials for productive secular use. The Victorian cataloguers of the vast mass of English state papers for the new Public Record Office started the series with Henry VIII, State Papers 1. If you go to the National Archives, modern history begins with Henry VIII. If we want to find England's last medieval monarch, then surely it was his father, Henry VII, dour and miserly and still fighting the Wars of the Roses. Or maybe the medieval period died on the battlefield of Bosworth, where that cross was lost, with Richard III, enabling Henry Tudor to usher in a new regime blessed by God to free England from tyranny. Well, that's certainly the image that Tudor royal propaganda strained to create. If you want to be more mischievous, then you might suggest that Henry VIII's daughter, Mary I, was England's last medieval ruler, Bloody Mary, who brought back the vicious religious persecution that England had thought it had left behind with the Lollards, a queen who was backward-looking by virtue of her Catholicism. You can tell from my tone of voice, except that this doesn't really work. Historians have rehabilitated Henry VII as at least an inspiring Renaissance monarch, building modern palaces, staging festivals that impressed visiting ambassadors from Burgundy and Italy, and asserting a new level of royal authority that could be picked up by his son Henry VIII. England's first ruling queen has also been freed from that Bloody Mary moniker, reassessed as a capable ruler and administrator whose Catholic restoration was also forward-looking, though the burning of hundreds of Protestants is difficult to airbrush out of the picture. What about Henry VIII as a modern monarch? Look closely at a lot of the art and architecture that he patronised, and it barely qualifies as Renaissance, if by Renaissance we mean the adoption of a classical style. Henry's building projects were hybrid, the application of a Renaissance patina to otherwise more conventional, vernacular or Gothic buildings. The same applies, I think, to portraits, where classical antique columns and caryatids kind of squeeze their way into and keep company with military motifs that would have been entirely recognizable to Henry's medieval forebears. Was Henry VIII's reign a turning point? That phrase so beloved of A-level examiners. By focusing on Henry VIII as defender of the faith with that question mark, our exhibition at the Antiquaries interrogates the contrary and even conflicting elements that make up both the reign and the man. The way that we periodize history can be arbitrary, a line drawn here or there to enable us to divide up the past in order to analyze it. At the University of York, I encourage my dissertation students, and I know that some former dissertation students are watching today, they'll recognize this, I encourage them to put a date range into their dissertation projects to construct an historical period to measure change over time. Well, deciding when medieval England ended and Renaissance or early modern England began could easily become a kind of arid academic exercise, obscuring the messy continuities and returns to the past that tend to characterize history. But in Henry VIII's case, I would say, thinking about the medieval and the modern has value for reasons that relate to the way that we remember the Tudors. No other period of English history is so intensively talked about, reimagined, appropriated for various causes, popularized and merchandised than the Tudors, with the possible exception of the Second World War on the edge of living memory. The Tudors have become a kind of brand, in the movies and on our television screens, but also on the things that we buy. In the gift shops of the historic royal palaces, do you see William III or George II on tins of humbugs and cookies? It's Henry VIII who sells, also Anne Boleyn, also Elizabeth I. Now, historic sites are familiar with this phenomenon, and often they privilege Tudor history when there are other narratives that could be told about that particular place. Hampton Court is really as much a 17th century as a 16th century site, especially the wonderful gardens. But a lot of the interpretation centers on Henry VIII, his art collection, his processional routes through the palace and their exciting new project, the privy apartments once occupied by the king, even if that requires, to be honest, some imaginative historical reconstruction. Henry VIII was the first king that his subjects would have been able to recognize from a realistic portrait on a coin. Because of their intensive use of new media, including portraits and print, the Tudors are also the first British royal family that we can fully visualize today. And that act of recalling the Tudors has been going on a long time. Victorian Britain revered Henry VIII for giving the people the Bible in English and a powerful navy to defend them from attack. The new Houses of Parliament, constructed from the 1840s, are full of Tudor royal iconography. And you can see me doing those kind of air punctuation marks because it's not really Tudor at all. It's 19th century Tudor, it's made up, including a statue and other representations of Henry VIII right in the heart of our Parliament. Well, that Victorian reverence for Henry VIII was not universal. Charles Dickens had a lot to say about Henry VIII in his A Child's History of England. I just couldn't resist quoting this. His conclusion, Dickens's conclusion, really says it all. He was a most intolerable ruffian, said Dickens, a disgrace to human nature and a blot of blood and grease upon the history of England. But even his notoriety has somehow increased the popularity of Henry VIII. He's a ruler that we need to understand better, not least because he is so present in our own time and in our own culture. And that's why this exhibition, modest in scale, but exceptional in some of the objects that we're displaying, attempts to do. Okay, now to the slideshow. To illustrate some of the paradoxes of continuity and change in Henry VIII's England, we can start with John Leland, who you see on the left of your screens, poet, royal chaplain, and antiquary. What you see here is Thomas Hearne's 18th century edition of the extraordinary itinerary that John Leland made around England between 1539 and 1545. Now, Leland was gathering information for a book that he hoped would be called De Antiquitate Britannica, and a catalogue of British writers from the Druids onwards. Well, no small project that, and you won't be surprised to hear that neither of those books ever appeared. But Leland did leave extensive and rather disordered notes. Now, you'll see on the screen here that Hearne describes him as John Leland the Antiquary. Leland adopted the continental practice of calling himself Antiquarius, which was Englished as antiquary. John Leland is the proto-antiquary. He's the first scholar in England to define himself in those terms. But what's his specific relevance to us? The antiquarian impulse is to preserve, to record, and to study the material traces of the past. And for Leland, that meant books. Books in the monastic libraries, a number of which he saved for the King's Library, where they still are, in fact, as the monasteries are being broken up. Leland was close to Henry VIII's regime. He had a commission directly from the king. And that suggests that Leland's collection of books and manuscripts was politically purposeful as well as scholarly in intent. Henry VIII did not create the new Church of England, as I still sometimes see in undergraduate essays. The king's whole argument was that he had reformed the English church, turning it back to an earlier state of purity that it had once enjoyed before it had become corrupted by Romish abuses. You could say that Henry VIII wanted to renationalize the church and its history. Well, let's move on to the first of our four themes in the exhibition, which is chivalry and pageantry. For the first few years of Henry VIII's reign, no one could have predicted the religious and constitutional upheavals to come. Henry focused his kingship on chivalry and magnificence, just like his fellow monarchs, Francis I of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. Celebrating feats of arms, male friendship, and the pursuit of beautiful women, chivalry captivated the young Henry VIII and his friends. Spectacular tournaments and pageants enabled Henry to display his skill on horseback and his bravery as a jouster. In 1520, the courts of England and France came together outside the still English town of Calais in the extravaganza known as the Field of Cloth of Gold. Intended as a diplomatic summit, the meeting also showcased the intense personal rivalry between Henry VIII and Francis I of France. Now, the slide that you see here is an 18th century watercolor copy of the Tudor painting, The Embarkation of Henry VIII at Dover, depicting Henry VIII setting sail for the Field of Cloth of Gold. Commissioned by Henry VIII and now in the royal collection, the original painting was designed to capture the power of the Royal Navy and the magnificence of the English court. The Society of Antiquaries 1779 version, which is what you see here, was painted by the Swiss watercolorist Samuel Hieronymus Grimm, who also copied other Tudor paintings for the Antiquaries. In 1781, Grimm's painting was in turn engraved by James Bessiere as one of a series of historical prints, including the Field of Cloth of Gold, so disseminating this image far beyond its original elite audience. Well, in the exhibition, we're using this image to emphasize Henry VIII as a military monarch. Now, you'll pick up on the mannered perspective of this image. It emphasizes the sweeping design of Henry VIII's new navy. My father was a naval architect. He designed warships. No warship that looks like that would ever have been able to sail. But you'll see that the innovative design of the gun ports cut through the hulls is showcased in this image. And of course, it's those gun ports that have fatal consequences for the flagship, the Mary Rose, in 1545. But look more closely, and you'll see that they're emblazoned with royal standards and shields and insignia. These ships were clearly intended to project royal power as well as to enforce it. Why did the UK park its latest aircraft carrier, HMS Prince of Wales, off Carbis Bay in Cornwall during the G7 summit so that it appeared in all the photos going around the world? I wonder. Well, the Society of Antiquaries version of this image, as you see it here, has another level of meaning. Grimm's painting and Bessiere's engravings were made in the 1770s and 1780s, a time when an imperial and domestic crisis, hello America, was prompting a movement to commemorate remarkable events in British history. It may even have been hoped that the publication of images such as the one that you see before you would encourage a sense of patriotism and national identity. So again, it's that use of the Tudors posthumously, long after the Tudor period has ended. Well, moving on to the Order of the Garter. This is the manuscript that I was referring to as really rather beautiful. It's a long roll of armorial bearings of the Order of the Garter as displayed in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Now, the Garter is England's senior order of chivalry. Founded in 1348 by King Edward III, Garter ceremonies take place in a church that was built by Henry VIII's grandfather, King Edward IV, and completed by his father, Henry VII. Charles, Duke of Burgundy, subsequently Charles I of Spain, subsequently the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, so that's all the same man, had been appointed a Knight of the Garter towards the end of Henry VII's reign, in an astute move to link the quite new Tudors to the fast-rising Habsburgs. Charles V spent several weeks in England in 1522, when London put on a spectacular pageant to welcome Charles and Henry VIII. And Charles also visited Windsor, where he would have been able to see his own insignia from all those years previously on display in the chapel. And much like at the Field of Cloth of Gold, Henry and Charles V jousted, hunted, played tennis, and went to mass all together. It was a triumph for propaganda and soft power, or so it seemed. But again, the diplomacy went awry. Charles promised to join Henry VIII in his war on France. In fact, Charles then left Henry completely in the lurch. And Charles also promised to marry the Princess Mary. In fact, it would be Charles's son, Philip II, who did that. Such are the oddities of 16th century marriage alliances. Well, look at these insignia. Would you imagine that there was any degree of difference between the status of Henry VIII and Charles V? One of them has the double-headed eagle of the Habsburgs, and the other the lions and fleur-de-lis that Henry had inherited from the Plantagenets. What would have struck anybody educated in heraldry is the closed imperial crown there, adopted by Henry VIII. It's a claim to be Charles's equal, that the Kingdom of England was an empire 10 years before that was stated in parliamentary statute. Except that Henry wasn't really Charles's equal. Charles V ruled Spain, most of Germany, the Netherlands, and a fair chunk of the New World. His income was more than 10 times Henry VIII, and he was the heir to the great Christian empire founded by Charlemagne in the 8th century. Henry VIII was not fully sovereign even within the British Isles. Scotland had its own ruling dynasty, and English rule in Ireland, when this image was created, extended barely over half the island. So what does this piece of royal propaganda tell us about Henry VIII's personality? We know that Henry VIII felt that keen personal rivalry with both Francis I and Charles V. Charles had a noble and ancient title as emperor. Francis did too. The title Most Christian Kings of France had become formalized in the 15th century. And this quest for a title of his own helps to explain how Henry VIII became defender of the faith in 1521. Track back a bit. 1517, an obscure, hitherto obscure, German priest and friar named Martin Luther set Europe ablaze with his 95 theses protesting against the corruption of the Catholic Church. The Pope declared Luther to be a heretic, but his writings spread rapidly thanks to the printing press and a ferment of politics in the principalities and city-states of the empire. In England, converts to the Reformed faith begin to surface in the universities and the Inns of Court, and even within the royal household itself. Henry VIII had met and been influenced by Erasmus, the Dutch humanist scholar who'd long been critical of aspects of Catholic practice. But the king was horrified by Luther's more radical brand of reform, which cast doubt on the meaning of the Mass. Henry VIII was a devoted attender of the Mass, sometimes several times a day, just like his medieval predecessors. Luther even called the sacred priesthood into question, setting out a theology of a priesthood of all believers. With Royal Secretary Thomas More, Henry VIII wrote a defense of the traditional 7 sacraments of the Catholic Church, the Assertio Septem Sacramentorum, and he dedicated it to Pope Leo X in 1521. His reward was the title Fidei Defensor, Defender of the Faith. Apparently, the Pope drew up a short list of titles, and this was the one that he chose. I rather like this idea of Henry VIII with a kind of drop-down menu of which title would you like for writing this treatise. Now, that title of Defender of the Faith was intended to be personal to Henry, but in 1543, a decade after the break from Rome, Parliament passes a statute permanently annexing that title to the English crown, hence its appearance on the 10-pence piece that I showed you right at the beginning of the lecture. Well, in our exhibition, you will see examples of the use of that title, Fidei Defensor, on Henry VIII's Great Seal at one end of the scale, and on a royal proclamation to London butchers setting the price that they could sell mutton and pork at the other end of the scale. 16th century government took economic regulation very seriously. But I've chosen another one of our objects, which you see on the left of your screens here, which is unique to the Antiquaries collection. The early 16th century panel of King Athelstan that you see here poses a number of questions. When it was made, where it was displayed, and why the early Tudor monarchy might have been associating itself with the emerging English monarchy of the 10th century. This, I would say, is a Tudor image of kingship, even though it does not depict the Tudors themselves. Athelstan, who ruled between 924 and 939, was one of the great warriors of the Anglo-Saxon period. He was a unifier of England, a loyal, devoted son of the church. Now, this painting is in oil on oak panels, and some tree ring analysis has been done on that wood. And it shows that the oak was English, and it shows that the oaks were felled sometime between 1500 and 1531. Now that gives us a date range of the later reign of Henry VII or the first half of Henry VIII. These Saxon king panels were acquired by the Society of Antiquaries in 1880 from a pretty obscure Kentish farmhouse, but they just can't have originated there. And the scholars who worked on this panel and the others like it have made a really exciting suggestion. The farmhouse where they were found is 6 miles from Eltham Palace, which was partially demolished during the English Civil War. The young Henry VIII built a chapel with linking apartments at Eltham on the model of Richmond Palace, where his father had created a sequence of heroic and saintly English kings along the processional route into the chapel. Henry VIII visited Eltham for Christmas 1515, which would have required the palace to be decorated, possibly quite quickly, for the king's procession to Mass. We can't be sure, but there's a real possibility that the panel that you see here was part of that sequence, reminding Henry VIII and his courtiers of the ancient and sacred origins of English royal power. And this connects back to my opening point about Leland, Henry VIII, and history. Leland's efforts were part of a broader propagandist strategy to use history to support the claims of Henry VIII's authority over church and state. Henry wanted to emphasize the continuity of his rule with the past, hence his interest in the Roman Emperor Constantine, who decriminalized the Christian faith and encouraged its spread within the Roman Empire. A similar strategy was pursued in the secular sphere. To promote his military campaigns in northern France, Henry VIII commissioned a biography of Henry V, whose crushing victory over the French at Agincourt could be used to celebrate English military might 100 years later. Henry VIII also had a posthumous portrait of Henry V painted, which is still in the royal collection, And another version of that is in our collection, in fact, of the Antiquaries. Meanwhile, at Westminster and at Windsor, the canons of the colleges of St. Stephen and St. George maintained a perpetual cycle of prayer for the monarchy, linking Henry VIII back to the memory of the great warrior king Edward III, from whom he was doubly descended. In ritual and in liturgy, Henry VIII was deeply connected to the past. Well, I've paired King Athelstan with a text close to Henry VIII. This tiny volume contains part of the correspondence between the king and Martin Luther, which is the context for Henry VIII being awarded that title, Defender of the Faith. Henry had read some of Luther's works, and Cardinal Wolsey, knowing that a royal refutation of heresy would go down well in Rome, encouraged the king to respond. Henry's secretary and friend, also one of his most high-profile victims, Thomas More, had a hand in crafting the king's Latin response to Luther. But we needn't doubt that Henry VIII himself was closely involved in this project. Henry VIII was no slouch when it came to Latin. Now, the sequence of response and rejoinder, an increasingly angry sequence between Henry VIII and Martin Luther, is quite complicated. But what you see here is Henry VIII's final word. It's a clear message that though he was open to reform, the radical Lutheran theology was not welcome in England. Now, if you look at the Latin, and I'm hoping that my cursor will, actually my cursor won't actually feature, but if you look under responsio and 3 lines down under responsio, you will see that Henry calls Luther heresiarcham, heresiarch. Well, a heresiarch is not simply a heretic, it's a founder of an entire nest, a sect of heretics. And that puts Martin Luther in the same sect, as the same category as the 4th century theologian Arius, who questioned the relationship between God the Father and God the Son and was condemned at the Council of Nicaea. So it's a very theological reference. Now, we, Kate and Maurice and I, examined this volume in the museum room at the Society of Antiquaries last week. And what strikes you about this, apart from the clear typeface, is the small format of this volume. It's essentially a pamphlet. It's easy to carry around in a pocket, and that must have been intentional. The text is in Latin, so it's aimed at scholars rather than the general public, but this is portable propaganda. And so on to the break with Rome and Henry VIII as reformer. Several factors fed into Henry VIII's decision to break from Rome in the early 1530s. His desire to be supreme head of the Church of England, with all the power and the revenues that would bring, is certainly one of them. Less cynically, we can say that Henry also wanted to rid his realm of superstition and to open up the word of God to the people. I don't think we need to doubt that. It's consistent with Henry's early interest in Erasmian humanism. We can also add the influence of the reformers present at court, including his chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, and his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, and perhaps his second wife, Anne Boleyn, although actually the evidence on that is deeply contested by historians. But none of those individual elements would have created a Reformation without the crisis over the succession to the throne. Henry VIII urgently needed a male heir. The only son born to Catherine of Aragon, also named Henry, died young. Naming Princess Mary as successor seemed unthinkable in an age when monarchy could still mean military leadership on the battlefield. Although, to be fair to Mary, actually she proved herself remarkably capable when fighting for the throne in 1553 and facing down Wyatt's rebels in London in 1554. But at any rate, Henry VIII tried for years to find a diplomatically and a theologically acceptable solution to the crisis that he was in. But when that failed, his only option was to declare unilaterally that his marriage had never taken place, freeing him to marry Anne. And as part of this process, historical sources were ransacked to prove that England had always been an empire, independent of any external allegiance. If the king was a driving force in this process, then so too were the courtiers and advisors who were eager to present to Henry a more capacious vision of royal power. Finally, Henry VIII was the equal of the Emperor Charles V, in his own eyes at least. The king's increased status is reflected in the more elaborate royal iconography of the 1530s, including portraits copied from Hans Holbein's original and the new Great Seal. Well, to the image that you see in front of you, Henry VIII with the pale green background. Now, with the best will in the world, this is probably not the most spectacular image of Henry VIII that you have ever seen. The Society's excellent catalogue of paintings is tactfully silent on the artistic merits of this image. Holbein and Huys van Cleve both did it better. Pretty clearly, this is a copy. Although actually, if you look at this closely, there is technical skill on display here, including the fictive shadow cast by the king's hat, and really close up, the calligraphic quality of the fur draped across Henry's shoulders and also his beard. Well, we're including this image in the exhibition to illustrate the new image that Henry VIII adopted in the mid-1530s in response to the break from Rome. It's a kind of Reformation rebranding and the changing appearance of the king. From about 1535, Henry is invariably depicted bearded, with his hair cut short, often concealed by a hat. Why do men cut their hair short in middle age? Maybe it was beginning to recede, making a rather obvious contrast with the beautiful youth who had excited such excitement in the teens, basically, and when he went to the field of cloth of gold. Now, our portrait catalogue that discusses this image points out that Henry's dress in this image is comparatively restrained. Now, it's artful, obviously. You can see the slashed jerkin here, revealing the russet doublet underneath. But this is more Henry VIII's kind of privy chamber day wear than an outfit for a feast day procession to the Chapel Royal. Now, that must have been deliberate. It's a more intimate portrait, I suspect, commissioned by one of the king's companions. But what it clearly demonstrates is that the royal image was being updated, copied, and disseminated to a degree that had never been witnessed before. Well, as I've just said, the new look accompanied a new royal title. The creation of Henry VIII as supreme head under Christ of the Church of England was authorised by Parliament, described in the document that you see here. By and large, the English Reformation was enacted by parliamentary statute and royal injunction, rather than popular iconoclasm or grassroots activism as took place in Germany. Whether or not Parliament actually rose as a result of the Reformation, I suspect it did, in fact, what we undoubtedly see is a far more elaborate language of parliamentary consent in order to justify government policy. Hence the long description of that voluntary assent in this proclamation. Now, the typeface may be a wee bit too small for you to look at this for yourselves. It is in English, but I can quote to you from this. Bishops and clergy, quote, have not only in convocation assembled, consented, recognised, and approved lawfully and justly, but also by word, oath, profession, and writing under their signs and seals, have confessed, ratified, corroborated, and confirmed the same, and here's the crucial bit, utterly removing all other oaths and obedience to any foreign potentates and all foreign jurisdictions. The Pope was now the Bishop of Rome. His power in England, not abolished, but long time usurped. It had simply never existed. It's less a declaration of independence than a claim that England had never legitimately been colonized by Rome in the first place. Now, this new dispensation had to be explained to the people, and that's what this printed document sought to do. This is a proclamation rather than a statute. It's a direct communication from the crown to its subjects. And this kind of proclamation was intended to be read out in public places. Look at the format. We've got a simplified version of the royal arms, and it ends with a shout, "God save the king," to which people were expected to respond heartily. Cromwell was known to have watchers in the crowds to see who wasn't shouting with the rest or throwing their caps up in the air. Right at the bottom of this, there's a very interesting detail in this proclamation that actually contrasts with the other proclamation that we're presenting to you. The other proclamation, the one to London butchers, was authorised by the Great Seal of England. This one is authorised under the signet, Henry VIII's own personal seal. And that suggests that this proclamation is very closely tied personally to the king. It just shows how aware he is of his new royal status and how anxious he is to defend it. Who was Henry VIII behind the mask of power, and what has been his legacy? Historians discuss many different versions of the king, from a domineering would-be tyrant to a man desperate to be liked and vulnerable to the influence of others. At this distance, putting Henry VIII in the psychiatrist's chair is as fraught with difficulty as it is, frankly, unpleasant. But to begin to understand him, it helps to think about Henry's consistent passions, his love for hunting, which took him on a series of progresses across England in company with his friends, his relationships with women, complex and frighteningly violent, but also capable of a kind of suffocating devotion, and his obsessive acquisition of luxury goods, from tapestries and jewels to sumptuous clothes, and believe it or not, clockwork toys. And that's what we see here. The inventory of Henry VIII. Some documents get you close to the authentic Henry VIII. One of them is his will, a copy of which we feature in our exhibition. But this is another one, the inventory of Henry VIII, drawn up within months of his death. The Antiquaries own one volume of this amazing manuscript. The other one's in the British Library. But here are listed all of the contents of the king's palaces, and that enables a detailed reconstruction of the material culture of the royal court, its rituals and ceremonies, its devotions, and its pursuits, from music to hunting. Now, I've only time to mention two extracts. Folio 34 of this inventory mentions monstrances, tabernacles, and tablets of silver and gilt, which if you didn't have the benefit of a Catholic education, then a monstrance is a kind of elaborate cross with a little chamber and a hinged window in which you place the sacrament, the body of Christ, essentially. That's a very Catholic sounding object, still to be existing within the contents of the Chapel Royal in 1547. So there's something interesting going on there. Folio 453 lists a number of masking costumes for women, including kirtles of blue velvet striped with gold. We know a lot more about Henry's queens than we used to. We would like to know a lot more still about Henry VIII's, about the women folk at Henry VIII's court. And there are various research projects going on to try and assess the importance of women at Henry's court. And that mention of women takes me to my final slide and my concluding point, which is the Great Seal of Elizabeth I, representing her in very traditional format with the orb and sceptre and riding on a horse. The difference being, of course, that Elizabeth, for propriety's sake, is riding side saddle. With more time, we could have discussed Henry VIII's legacy as received and interpreted by his daughter Elizabeth I, her own reading of the necessity to defend the faith, her reworking of her father's title of supreme head becomes supreme governor of the Church of England, the title held by all subsequent British monarchs, and a use of propaganda to define and defend the authority of a woman ruling. And I'm happy to answer questions about that. But hopefully this talk has brought out some of the paradoxes inherent in a ruler who dissolved monasteries, but also endowed Latin masses to be said for his soul in St. Stephen's, Westminster, who actively defended the Catholic faith, but then abolished the power of the Pope, who authorized the first Bible in the English language, but loathed Martin Luther and persecuted Protestant preachers during the 1540s. The online exhibition goes live tomorrow on the Society of Antiquaries website, which is listed here. There you have the Twitter handle of the Society and me personally at Tudor Gentleman. I've been John Cooper. It's been very nice to talk to you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
John, thank you so much. That was fantastic. Not only giving us an insight into the exhibition, but also into the man himself. I certainly feel I know an awful lot more about him than I did before. So thank you very much. We've got some questions coming in. The first one is from Devon Scobie in Edinburgh. Could Henry have still broken with Rome if it had not been for Anne Boleyn acting as catalyst?
Would Henry or could Henry have broken from Rome without Anne Boleyn as a catalyst? The extent to which Anne Boleyn as a catalyst is very interesting, very controversial. And essentially there are two different readings of this. There's a kind of a feminist reading, and there's a kind of rather more dour Tudor political history reading. Certainly, the nature of the relationship between Henry VIII and Anne is conducted through books and prayer books. And for Anne Boleyn, who affected to kind of speak French as her native language, she is rather daringly reading the Psalms in French, and she is certainly presenting those texts to Henry. There's doubt about whether Anne actually presented the works of William Tyndale to Henry VIII, but if she did that, then certainly that is Anne as a catalyst. The alternative reading is that Anne was too politically canny to do that and wouldn't have risked doing that. I think that even if Anne Boleyn wasn't in the picture, then there were other figures at court, particularly Cromwell, particularly Cranmer, although Cranmer was advanced by Anne, of course, to Henry's view, who were presenting Henry with ways of getting around this crushing constitutional crisis that he faced. So I suspect that some sort of a break from Rome, given the fact that at the critical moment, the Pope could not pronounce the divorce or annulment that he would otherwise probably quite happily have pronounced because of the close personal relationship between Catherine of Aragon and the Habsburgs, who had the Pope prisoner at exactly the wrong moment. Some sort of a break from Rome might have happened, but I think it's important to distinguish the break from Rome and the Reformation, and the processes that kind of snowball into the Reformation of dissolving monasteries and ultimately bringing in an English prayer book and so on. The question about whether those needed necessarily to follow from the break from Rome is a very big one. And there is one way of reading the supreme headship that all it gives Henry VIII is the title and the power that Francis I, as a great Catholic king, already has anyway. And there are some signs that the papacy in the 1540s is open to negotiation with Henry VIII and getting him back as a loyal son of the Catholic Church. So it's not like all bets are off once the supreme headship has been declared. That's a very random, rather rapid and slightly tangential answer to your question, but I hope it says something of interest anyway.
It may have been another lecture, I suspect. You may have already answered this then from Meg Ford. Why was the title Defender of the Faith not rescinded by the Pope after Henry's break with Rome?
Well, essentially it is, along with, Henry is excommunicated, of course, but excommunication is a movable feast in the 16th century. And I think that there is actually, as I was saying, quite a lot of negotiation that goes on in the later 1530s and early 1540s, as Henry sort of retreats from the evangelical position that he's previously espoused when Cromwell has been around. And so that title of Defender of the Faith and the title, the kind of the sense of being close to the Pope is up for diplomatic negotiation, I think. But what, of course, happens is that Parliament takes this out of the Pope's hands, in a sense, and it's rather an odd thing to do in some senses, because that title, when it is promulgated, it's so closely connected with the fight against Luther and so closely connected with the papacy, actually. But the title remains, but the meaning of that title really changes utterly once Parliament sort of nationalizes that title, and then, as I said, in a statute in the early 1540s, sort of annexes it permanently to the English crown. So the title of Defender of the Faith that subsequent monarchs hold is totally different from the title that was granted by the Pope, with the unique exception of Mary I. And of course, Mary I, who's a Catholic, returns to being a genuine defender of the faith in the eyes of the papacy. She also, at least for some of her reign, rather uncomfortably, is supreme head of the church. Now, she doesn't like that, but she makes use of the royal supremacy for the first couple of years of her reign. She doesn't simply immediately hand back authority to the Pope. So there are some very interesting comings and goings with these the sort of jurisdictions of these royal titles.
Following on from that, I think Freya Carroll asked, do you believe that some of Henry's response to Luther that granted him Defender of the Faith wasn't all written by Henry?
Yes, I do believe that. Thank you, Freya, for that question. I think that Henry VIII read Latin reasonably effectively, and he could write notes to himself in Latin. He could deal with the Latin of the Psalms and a Missal. I don't think Henry VIII was up to composing tracts in the sort of humanist Latin that was being espoused by people like Thomas More. I mean, this isn't that unusual. Lots of works are co-authored in this period. We tend to think of authorship as being single. Authorship in the 16th century, in the Renaissance period, is very often multiple, and even texts as apparently individually authored as Thomas More's Utopia actually have the hand of more than one person. So certainly Thomas More is, and possibly other scholars at Henry's court, are guiding Henry and advising him, and I think polishing his Latin, I would say. But I don't think there's anything doubtful about that. I think that as Henry VIII's secretary, and particularly his Latin secretary, that's precisely what Thomas More is supposed to do. So Henry VIII and Thomas More are discussing this, and More is crafting their discussions into rather showy humanist Latin of the sort that Erasmus and More communicate to each other in. So actually, I suspect that the Latin that's being used is actually distinctive, and so More and Henry's Latin is sort of subtly distinct from Martin Luther's Latin.
Thank you. And I think you might have already answered this one from Peter Stiefel, who says, thank you for a wonderful talk. Can you discuss the importance of how Mary returned the title of Defender of the Faith back to its Catholic origin? But I think you've touched on that when she became queen.
Yes, I mean, she inherits that title. And of course, for a brief period, the papacy thinks, well, great, we've got a monarch who is actually once again defending the faith. And Mary takes that title very seriously and really inhabits that identity. And it is of profound importance to her that she holds that title, because of course it takes Mary back to the early days of the early 1520s, when Henry VIII and her mother, Catherine of Aragon, seemed to be happily married. And Mary was a princess in the royal line. And so she does look back to that period with great affection, I think. And I don't think that Mary is simply attempting to restore medieval Catholicism, but I do think she's trying to recapture some of the vigor of English Catholicism before the Reformation period, which is a slightly different thing. As I was saying, I think in a sense, the more complex title for her is the fact that she inherits the title Supreme Head of the Church of England. She doesn't want that at all, but actually she has to make use of that title in order to initially to keep herself on the throne, to pass the statutes through Parliament that she needs to pass. Now, ultimately, she renounces that title when the papacy comes back, but that's a long process of negotiation that is required, and it raises all sorts of questions. That if the Pope's coming back, then does that mean that the monasteries are coming back? Because pretty much everybody at Parliament and the royal court had invested in monastic lands. Would they have to give them back? So there was a kind of, I can still remember my history teacher at school talking about, this was the brilliance of Thomas Cromwell, that he created a vested interest in the Reformation by dissolving monasteries, that those assets got distributed so broadly amongst the English elite that there was really no going back there. So, yeah.
Oscar Patton says, thank you for a fabulous paper. Does a list survive of the alternative titles Henry could have selected in place of Defender of the Faith? And why do you think he chose the one he did?
Thank you, Oscar, for that very difficult question. You've got me bang to rights on that. This was me. I talked about Henry VIII ransacking history. This was me ransacking biographies of Henry VIII, and that was a detail that I found in Lucy Wooding's excellent biography of Henry VIII, and it was within a broader discussion actually of the very positive relationship, the bizarrely positive relationship that Henry VIII genuinely had with the papacy right up until the point of the Reformation. So that title of Defender of the Faith is actually confirmed by Pope Clement, who follows on from Pope Leo. And it illustrates just how pro-papal Henry VIII was into the mid to late 1520s, and how pro-Henry VIII the papacy is. So yes, I'm sure that list exists. No, I haven't looked at it for myself, but look up the index of Henry VIII Fidei Defensor in Lucy Wooding's excellent biography of Henry. And what actually that takes you to Jack Scarisbrick's discussion of that. So you've got to go back via Wooding to Scarisbrick, published in the 60s, published even before I was born, actually. So it's something that Scarisbrick discusses. But you'll enjoy following that up, I'm sure.
Okay, I think maybe just one or two more. Mike Marriott wants to know, would any of this have happened if Catherine of Aragon had produced some male children?
Again, that's an extremely good, it's fascinating kind of might have been. Would any of this happen? Yes, some of this would happen, but I think that the key difference would be that that the monarchy would not have hitched itself to evangelical reform, Protestantism, whatever you want to call it, if Henry VIII had had a male heir. And I suspect that, it's always interesting to speculate, would England have remained a Catholic country? For the moment, very probably, actually, yes, it would. What wouldn't have changed is the kind of inspiration or onslaught, depending on how you want to view this, of Protestant ideas coming in from the continent. So those radical ideas for reform, that Lutheranism would still have been imported into England in the 1520s and 1530s. And you'd still have found, eager young people wanting to kind of resist the world that they've inherited from their parents. You'd still have found those eager young people converting in the universities, in Oxford and Cambridge, and in the Inns of Court. And some of those people would have started to make their way in royal service. What you wouldn't have had, and this kind of connects with a previous question about Anne Boleyn, what you wouldn't have had, I think, is authorized evangelical preaching at court. And that's something that Henry isn't too keen on, actually, but Anne is really keen on. And those evangelical preachers are able to proceed under Anne's personal protection, actually. And of course, when Anne falls, those preachers are left totally exposed, and a number of them end up in prison or being executed. So much would have been very different. The break from Rome would not have happened in the way that it happened. Some form of Protestant Reformation would have been pushing against England for sure. I suspect the monasteries might still have been dissolved, because monasticism was deeply criticised, less so by Thomas More actually than by Erasmus, who'd had a pretty unhappy time, shall we say, as a monk himself. And monasticism it's not on its last legs. I could, living in Yorkshire, I could never say that, but there is pressure to turn the monasteries into new kinds of institutions, particularly schools. So I think that the great monasteries of medieval England would certainly have changed. So it's a kind of varied response to your question.
Fair enough. I think we'll just take one more. Barbara English would like to know if there are any records of when Henry came north into East Yorkshire in 1541 and brought 2 companies of actors, the King's Men and the Prince's Men, who were given rewards by the Beverley governors. And although we don't know of any performances, this seems an odd thing to bring on a progress. Did he use actors and whatever their plays were as propaganda? Quite a long question.
This isn't. Yeah. Okay. This isn't. I promise I haven't planted this question. I mean, it's an exceptionally good question, and the answer is we don't quite know yet, but we might know in about 3 years' time, because in conjunction with the Society of Antiquaries, Anthony Musson at Historic Royal Palaces and I have been running a network for the last 18 months called Henry VIII on Tour, which is specifically setting up a big research project, we hope, on Henry VIII's royal progresses. And of course, the longest and in many ways the most mystifying of Henry VIII's progresses is the one that comes north in 1541 to Hull and to York. We know that wherever Henry VIII went, urban communities put on performances to welcome the king to town, rather tedious allegorical performances of various kinds, generally, expressing fawning loyalty to the king and then asking for something, asking for a royal charter or something like that. What's more interesting is the idea of Henry VIII actually taking actors and players with him. Now, using actors as propaganda, I'm not sure I would go that far. At least I wouldn't go that far yet. We certainly know that Henry VIII he ports huge amounts of stuff from the royal court to take with him on progress. So he does set up the Chapel Royal wherever he goes. He takes Chapel Royal singers with him. He brings his own hunting hounds, and he brings an astonishing array of clothes. Some of those clothes were masking clothes. So there is the possibility of interactive, dramatic performances being put on when the king is on progress. That's as far as I can push that now, until we find out more, either from the state papers or, more likely, as was hinted in the question, more that's surviving in local authority records, whether that's the Civic Guild records of Beverley or the York municipal records. I mean, those have been searched actually, but it's possible that somebody will turn up something in an unexpected place. We may find out more about those interactions between the king and the localities, and that could be to do with drama. It could be to do with all sorts of other ritual and propaganda and music, I think, which is something that I'm particularly interested in.
John, thank you so much. I think I'm going to have to call it to an end there in terms of questions. I think we've covered everything else that was there, and lots of people saying what a fantastic talk it was. So thank you so much for sharing your scholarship with us, but also the wonderful objects, paintings, everything else that we do have in the Society's collections. And as John said, do visit the online exhibition. Of course, we would have liked to have had it that people could come in, but under the circumstances, the exhibition is online. And please also note that our next public lecture is by the other curator of the online exhibition, Professor Maurice Howard, who's one of our vice presidents of the Society. And he's going to be talking about the Royal Chapel in the 16th century buildings and fittings on Tuesday, the 20th of July at 1 o'clock. Please also note that our full autumn event program is live on our website and bookings are open. All our events are free and open to anyone to join. And you can also sign up to Salon, our fortnightly e-newsletter, through our website, and you can find information about upcoming events and news about the Society there as well. So thank you again, John, so much for that fantastic lecture, and thank you all for watching. Goodbye.